Hello everyone, my name is Tiffany Monk and I did the interpretive presentation. For my interpretive presentation, I did two poems by Maya Angelou. These poems were I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and Still I Rise. Now before I start my presentation, I did a little biographical sketch prior, and that is Maya Angelou was born on April 4th, 1928 in St. Louis, Missouri, but later moved to Arkansas. She was an African American woman who experienced racial prejudice and discrimination firsthand in Arkansas. Angelou grew up to be a civil rights activist, poet, and award-winning author. She was especially known for her 1969 memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. To continue on, I'll start with my thesis. My thesis was Maya Angelou's poems, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and Still I Rise, showcase the resilience of African American community in their fight for freedom throughout history. Now to move on through passage one. Passage one is from the first poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The passage is, "But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing." That was from stanza 2 in that poem. My first talking point is, in the first part of the stanza, Angelou speaks of oppression, and that continues to the lines, "But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage." Angelou is basically alluding to the bird being oppressed inside the cage, obviously. The bird is a representation of the African American community as a whole, and the cage is a representation of racial oppression. The bird is confined within the cage, and it can barely see out and is blinded with rage. The lines "can seldom see through his bars of rage" is actually a double entendre. This is because the bird is stuck in a narrow cage that he can't necessarily see out of, but that isn't the only reason why he can't see. The bird is blinded with rage for being forced into this cage in the first place. To move on to my second talking point, this continues through the last couple of lines. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird, who is a metaphor for African Americans, is stripped of any form of freedom and is forced into solitude. However, despite the restrictions, the bird opens his throat to sing. The only thing the bird can do, really, is use his voice to sing through his sufferings and cry for the freedom he longs to have. The third talking point is, it can also be inferred that the bird chooses to sing rather than attempt to violently escape because, in the past, slaves would sing through their most grueling times. Many of the spiritual songs created during the period of slavery were not sung with happiness, but rather sung with rage, anger, despair, and hope towards a dream they wished to achieve. This was a form of kinship and expression for the ungodly treatments they had to endure. To further describe what I mean by this talking point, basically, the reason that I believe Maya Angelou chose to have the bird sing rather than do a poem where the bird is fighting so hard to escape physically is because she wanted to showcase that her ancestors, although facing terrible, terrible treatments in the past, would sing through it. That was almost their form of therapy. They would have to sing through it and hope that maybe someday they could reach the dream of freedom that they so long had thought to achieve. To go on, I had a second passage from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This passage was, "But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom." This was from both stanzas 5 and 6. So for my first talking point, I talk about how I chose two stanzas. These both related back to my thesis of resilience within the Black community. Stanza 5 starts with, "But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams, his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream," and ends with a repetition of the bird's feet being tied, his wings being clipped, and his throat opening to sing. Now, the stanza, I believe, is referring to the past of African Americans and the dreams that were lost along the road to freedom. The bird, the Black community, stands upon its ancestors' dreams and tries to utilize its shadow to reach outside the cage. Its scream is a combination of its longing for freedom and its ancestors' dream for freedom. So essentially what I'm saying is, in this talking point, the first part of this, so this right here, I believe she is relating back to what her ancestors originally wanted. Her ancestors wanted freedom, and currently now, well, not now, but at the time of this poem, she wanted freedom for the Black community. So she's combining the longings of her ancestors and the longings of the people she knows now. So that's essentially what I was saying for that one. The second talking point is the next stanza is repetitive and originated from stanza number 3. This stanza, the cage bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the cage bird sings of freedom. Now, I didn't include it in the first part of this poem for the first part all the way up here, but this stanza is repeated twice. The first time you see it in the third stanza, and then the second time you see it in stanza number 6. So this stanza pretty much means that Angelou is reiterating the resilience that the Black community has. The cage bird, despite being confined inside a cage, is still singing for freedom. The situation appears hopeless, but this doesn't deter the cage bird from singing loudly to distant hills so that its dream of freedom is heard long and far. Rather than giving up and becoming complacent with the cage, the bird is resilient and continues to fight for its freedom, just like the Black community did. Now that was the end of what I had for I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. I'm going to go on to the poem Still I Rise from the first passage that I chose. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines, digging in my own backyard. This was from both stanzas 4 and 5. Now my first talking point is, my Angelou Still I Rise poem is describing the defiance that a Black woman has when faced with oppression. Not only that, but this poem feels like a celebration of being a Black woman and a civil rights activist. The lines, "Do you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes?" I believe Angelou is alluding to how white people wanted Black people to feel. The Black community had been broken down for years on end, and they were expected to essentially give in and shut up. History has shown that African Americans were treated poorly and expected to serve or live by the rules of white people. However, Angelou is fighting back in these lines. She is being sarcastic towards the expectations of white people. She is practically laughing at the idea of bowing down to them and refuses to do so. My second talking point was the next stanza, which would be stanza number 5, showcases the continuation of her refusal to comply in the lines, "Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I got gold mines digging in my own backyard." In these lines, Angelou is showing that she has pride in being Black and she is proud of who she is. She then adds a sarcastic tone when implying, "Aw, does it offend you?" She is tired of being beaten down and told to feel sorry for who she is, and because of this, she flips the script and is sarcastically saying sorry. Her resilience then carries onto the lines of laughter and gold mines. Despite the oppression, racism, and prejudiced society, she still has a laugh that isn't tainted. She will still rise up regardless of the way she is treated, and she will flaunt who she is, what she stands for, and will be proud of it. She will not allow anyone or anything to take away her identity as a Black woman. To go back to this talking point, just so that I can make sure that I'm clear, when I speak about the lines, a sarcastic tone, within here, she says, "Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard." When I read, "Don't you take it awful hard," I read it in a sarcastic tone, which I'm assuming that's what she meant, like, "Aw, like, sorry that you have to take this so hard, like, oh, sorry this offends you." Because over the years, she's been mistreated by these people, and why should she care if it offends them anymore? Why should she care if being herself is offending other people? She doesn't want to be oppressed any longer. So that's where I got the sarcasm from. To move on to passage number 2 of Still I Rise. This passage was, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. This was from the last stanza, which was stanza number 9. My first talking point is, in the last stanza of the poem, Maya Angelou explains that she is the bridge of hope between the ancestral African American and the current African American. She is the bridge that combines the dreams of the past with the dreams of the present and future. Specifically in the lines, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, and bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. These lines are showing to me that Maya Angelou believes in triumph rather than oppression, and that she is the actualization of her ancestors' dreams. And then my second talking point builds off of that. So, building off of that, Angelou says that she inherited gifts from her ancestors. These gifts are essentially her life. Her ancestors survived through inhumane and cruel conditions so that Maya Angelou could become who she was, a free-writing Black woman. It seems like she is paying homage to her ancestors by referring to her current life as a gift, thanks to them surviving so that she could become an activist and continue to fight for freedom by using her voice. Angelou would continue to be resilient so that her freedom as a Black woman could be much more attainable. She knew that remaining compliant and silent would not result in freedom from oppression. So, to clarify anything on that, when I read it as bringing gifts that my ancestors gave, I took it as the gifts that they gave her is essentially her life, the life that she's living now. Although there's still discrimination, oppression, racial prejudice, she's not living her life as a slave. So her ancestors who were slaves, their life was essentially a gift to her for her life. So them surviving these cruel conditions was a way for Maya Angelou to become who she was and become a free-writing Black woman who could use her voice to inspire those who are a part of her community and pay homage in order to essentially continue to fight for freedom and to gain the equality that her ancestors could never gain. So what I'm saying is they survived these conditions but didn't obtain freedom. But these gifts were then passed on to Maya in her life, and she was able to obtain that freedom, which is essentially giving back to her ancestors and then also giving to the generations that come after her. My final thoughts were, Maya Angelou was an inspiring civil rights activist and poet. She wrote many poems and essays that exploited her personal struggles with racial discrimination. Her poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, was inspired after meeting with writer James Baldwin. James Baldwin was an American essayist, novelist, and playwright that had a passion for discussing activist ideas and becoming a voice that combated racism. Angelou wrote Why the Caged Bird Sings poem after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It was her way of mourning her friend's death and to shed light on her struggles of being an African-American woman. These poems were truly inspirational and remind us of the sufferings she, along with the Black community, had to endure on the road to freedom. Each poem resonates with defiance, hope, and resilience in order to accomplish one long-awaited shared dream, freedom. This correlates back to some of our assigned readings that we've had in class, like A Dream Deferred, Dream Boogie, Harlem, and Kitchenette Building, which all resonated with having to overcome obstacles in order to achieve their dreams, or simply having a barrier between them and their dream. All in all, these poems truly radiated brilliance, beauty, and triumph. I then also included 2 appendixes. The first appendix includes the first poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The second appendix includes Still I Rise. So I included these because we didn't have these as assigned readings. So if anyone who is watching this presentation or is going to reply to this presentation doesn't necessarily know exactly what I'm talking about, I have the poems below so that you can understand the context behind everything. So yeah, that was really my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I enjoyed doing it. Thank you very much.